Good afternoon, I'm James Hewison, and I have never written for either the stage nor the screen, which doesn't necessarily qualify me particularly perhaps to run this session, but I will anyway. I am the convener of the session today. On my immediate right, I'm sure someone who's very familiar to you all, as she pretty much owns and runs this town for the next week or so, Katrina Sedgwick. Someone I'm sure also very well known to you on her immediate right is Andrew Bavell, who has actually written for stage and for screen. Andrew Bavell. And on Andrew's right is Oscar Redding. Oscar is the co-writer as well as one of the lead actors in Van Diemen's Land, which premieres at this very festival on Thursday of next week. Oscar Redding. And on Oscar's right, on my far right, is Chris Drummond. Chris is a director of theatre and co-runs?
Artistic director
of Brink Theatre here in Adelaide. Please welcome Chris Drummond. I think we have about an hour or so. Obviously, we'll do a fair bit of talking to begin, but obviously very keen for you to have input, to express your views, ask questions and so forth. What I thought I'd do to begin, in fact, an article that I have just read from a Melbourne newspaper I thought would be particularly salient to this afternoon's conversation, which is a piece that appeared in Today's Age, written by Bruce Beresford, the director, and he's currently a film director. He's currently in Melbourne directing a theatre play. So I thought I'd read you some of Mr. Beresford's wisdom as he reflects upon the differences, or otherwise, of directing theatre as distinct from cinema. I won't read the entire article. I quote, Peter Hall, indisputably one of the finest stage directors, in brackets, of both theatre and opera, has never made a successful film, despite numerous attempts. It is quite apparent, to me at any rate, that he confines himself to talking to the actors and lets the cameraman, shock horror, decide the angles. And then he says, this is like owning a Ferrari but never learning to drive. Speaking generally, many stage directors have a somewhat snobbish attitude to movie directors, considering them to be mere technicians, quite adept at manipulating the emotions of the audience through camera angles, clever editing, and so on and so forth. So one of the key themes of today is not necessarily, hopefully, at least about snobbishness between theatre and film, but it's very much about comparing the collaborative, the development processes, developing work for theatre and developing work for cinema. So one of the things that I'd first like to put to each of the people on my right is describing what they feel are the vital ingredients in that collaborative process, be it for stage, be it for screen, and then perhaps we can identify a couple of personal examples that illustrate effectively both and perhaps make that comparison as a result. So, Katrina?
Yeah, well, I suppose we've been talking about this quite a lot within our film festival, I suppose through our investment fund. I've been struck, having come from a theatre background.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the investment fund, just in case everybody's...
Okay, so the Adelaide Film Festival has an investment fund. We put money into a range of different projects. We've got 12 premiering at this year's festival, and they range from feature film, short film, documentary. We've invested in a cross-platform work before. This time we've commissioned a video installation work that's just on at the Samstag Museum. Don't miss it. Through that, we've invested in projects which have come to us in a range of different forms. So sometimes we receive a finished script, and it's a very polished, finished script written by a writer, which a director is going to direct. In other cases, say with 10 Canoes, Rolf de Heer presented us with 10 pages of photos and some notes, and he then went and created that film in an incredibly collaborative process with the community and his other kind of key creative partners. In the case of something like Boxing Day, we received a 22-page scriptment. This is a film that we commissioned last festival. Creef Stenders and his lead actor Richard Green had co-written a work which was, it had a series of kind of guiding points through a narrative structure. It had a number of bits of dialogue that gave you a kind of a sense of what it could be. But in the end, the process was, in a sense, quite a theatrical one, in that you had 3 weeks in a building with a creative team of filmmakers and actors, your designer, your sound people, and everybody really improvised and created the film collaboratively over 3 weeks. And so I suppose, coming from the film festival's perspective, we're really struck by that kind of breadth of ways that people are creating work from the screen, but also overwhelmingly struck how it's inevitably dominated by, we receive a finished script which appears to have been written by a writer or a writer-director with the support of the producer, but the other kind of key collaborators that end up bringing that script alive on the screen are often quite separate to that process. And for a visual medium, I find that quite odd. For a medium that's about sound, I find that quite odd. And also, it also seems to me that quite often the writer leaves the process in some way once the script is handed over, and it becomes much more a director-driven medium. Chris and Andrew will talk a bit today about how they created a work for the stage recently, and I think it's a very interesting model that perhaps could be looked at and explored a bit more in the way that we fund films in Australia, because I just don't think there's a lot of choice and flexibility for practitioners to try other ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think obviously what we're going to be talking about is, just to pick up on something that you said, whether there is actually something wrong with the fact that once a film production starts, it effectively sheds so many of those key creative collaborators who've been with the project or who have conceived the project effectively. Andrew, what are some of the vital ingredients? Perhaps if you could use fine art examples from theatre work as well as, and film.
Well, I think the background to this for me has kind of come out of a general consensus that's been growing in the Australian film industry over the last few years, that there's a problem with the films we make and that they're not connecting with an audience. Australians don't want to go and see our films. And a lot of reasons have been chucked up about why that's happening. And one of the ones that's kind of gained currency recently is that the scripts aren't good enough. Now, I'm not quite sure when people make that observation which script they're talking about, because the script that's written is quite often not the script that's screened, because it goes through an extensive process of change. And as a writer, I'd be arguing very strongly that the writer needs to be involved in that process of change, and as soon as they're not, there's a problem. So that's an important question to me. What script are we evaluating? But the other kind of issue for me is that I think we've narrowed our understanding and scope about what a screenplay is. And just to kind of give Katrina some credit, she's very unusual in the Australian filmscape in that she will respond positively to 10 pages of notes and photographs and still want to encourage that as a possibility, as a way of moving forward. I think we've kind of narrowed our understanding through a kind of bureaucratic framework of what a screenplay is. So and how a screenplay is written and funded and developed. And I think I'm a great believer in if you have a means of production that is quite rigid, it will keep turning out a very similar product. And we've lost a flexibility about the way we go about making our films. So we as writers in the film industry are constricted in our ability to talk about process, which is something we value enormously in theatre. And I might as well cite, When the Rain Stops Falling here, because this is a process which Chris initiated with his company Brink Productions, and he was particularly interested in a work coming out of a true form of collaboration. So he brought visual artist Hossein Valamanesh to get, and myself, Chris as director, and Quentin Grant as composer together to begin a kind of long-term collaboration through which a final script would be the result. And that was a long process that we'll talk about later, but I'm really interested in how we can apply that kind of process to film writing. A few years ago we were all talking about Mike Leigh. We all loved his films, and the films came out of a collaborative process. And that's gone very out of fashion at the moment. Nobody talks about that or does it that way, and it's very difficult to do that in Australia. So somebody like me who's got 1.5 feet in theatre and half a foot in film, I want to work in a different way because I know how wonderful that process can be. And it is true that in film, most directors and producers don't want to know you as a writer once the film starts shooting. They feel uncomfortable with you being around. And if you essentially have generated that story and the story comes from you, that's a great loss to the collaborative process. And so when our films are being finally being released and people are going, gee, it's not quite connecting, it's not quite working, I think one of the reasons, or there are two reasons for me. One is the way those screenplays have been developed, and that quite often the writer has not been involved right through the process, particularly the editing. Not sure if that addressed your thing, but that's kind of what I'm interested in.
Okay, still searching for those vital ingredients. Oscar, what was it that we can come to those? What was it that because your background, and forgive me if this is not entirely the case, but your background has largely been in theatre. Is that true? What was it that? Why did you decide to work in film?
Mainly personal reason in this. It was probably just out of desperation, I think. There are only 2 theatre companies really in Melbourne. So the idea of ever earning any kind of money as a writer, actor or director in Melbourne, I sort of realised pretty quickly was never going to happen. And I kind of got the feeling that at least at the end of the day, with a film, if you've put a lot of work in, you still had your product sitting there that you could sell on.
Yeah.
I think it was just, in the end of the day, it was just that thing of realising that it was a pretty closed group of people, and it wasn't so much a negative thing. It was just a realisation that, you know, these people only have a certain amount of work to give to anyone, you know. So it's not sort of like, oh, fuck them, they're not going to give me any work. It was just like, well, they just don't have any work to give out. Just picking up on a point that Andrew made, a friend of mine, Raimondo, who I was talking to you about before, who's a writer, he came up with an interesting point once at the same sort of thing where people are saying, oh, we don't have any good writers in this country sort of thing. And Raimondo's reply to that was, it's not so much the writers, it's the readers, because I remember very distinctly reading Chekhov for the first time as an actor, and if you've never flicked open one of those plays and read it without seeing them, it'll kill you. It literally will kill you. It's about 4 hours of the most boring thing you'll ever scroll through, and yet when you understand it, suddenly you actually realise that it's brilliant. So it is that thing. You hand over your play to someone or your screenplay to someone, and if they don't know how to read it, then of course, you know, they're going to just hand it back and say it's a heap of shit. I just recently came out of doing a development on a screenplay that I was given funding for, and the process was based on me working with an editor who I'd never met before,
who was grafted on.
Yeah. And so we were basically, you know, I was taken on. He took on the piece, and I, you know,
and that was provisional on.
On getting the funding. So you know, he was a lovely guy. He knew unbelievable amounts about film. But it became very clear at the end when I sort of thought about the whole thing. Whereas I was trying to do something like Naked, he was sort of trying to write the Titanic, which of course was going to have some extraordinary problems. I don't know. I think the sort of answer to what's that question that you want to know the
vital ingredients.
Yeah, the vital ingredients I think is kind of like asking how big's your dick. You know, it just depends on what water I'm in at the time. I think depending on the project that you're working on.
I'm just trying to get that out of my head, actually. Sorry,
I haven't got the analogy at all.
It strangely came from a.
Quickly change the subject.
No. It came from doing a piece with John Bayliss, who was a part of the group Sydney Front, and I was a young actor, and he got us to do this thing where we had to draw ourselves naked, at one point during the show, and it was this weird thing where you sort of, your audience is sort of sitting right next to you and you're sort of sketching away. And at one point I just got to my cock and I thought, okay, every night I kind of would go out and go, well, and then I realised it's because, well, fuck it, if I've just got out of a cold river, a la Van Diemen's Land, there's nothing there. Whereas I've just been involved in saucy time, it's different. So I think the point being...
Is that some sort of weird...
Yeah, no, there is a point. I'm going to get to the point.
Come and see my movie so you can see me get out of a river.
No, that's Mark. Right. You get to see Mark with his cock in Van Diemen's Land. But at the end of the day, it just depends on the project. So, the water temperature or whatever, but that's the point.
Okay, well, let me put it to you this way. For example, in the evolution, transition, movement from theatre into film for you, what are some of the non-negotiables? I mean, you have it, at least as much as I know, you've taken your crew of collaborators from your theatre projects with you into film. Or, I mean, not with you necessarily, it's not like you're captain of the team, but that you've effectively made that transition together.
Yeah.
Was that a non-negotiable?
It was that I couldn't not use those people.
Yeah,
no, fuck that. No, not at all. Basically, everyone was, when we were going into make the feature. There was only one from doing the short. The short was quite good, and it was, we'd worked very hard on it. But certainly there was only one actor in the short that wasn't negotiable, which was Mark, because he'd been unbelievably brilliant at it.
Yeah.
And so everyone else, including myself, was completely up for negotiation. And it just got to that point where we realised, or just through default, it became that thing where I could already speak, Gaelic badly. So there was a chance that I might be able to speak it okay by the time we got to the feature. And the others, it just fell into place that they'd been on that experience, and certainly by doing a very good job and not a brilliant job, you might just get it brilliant by the next time you get to do it. And it kind of is similar to theatre in that way, by having done the short film before we did the feature, where it was kind of like a workshop on what the feature might be. And
we'll get back to that in a little bit more detail in a minute, which is to say that the short film from which, to be fair to say, the feature film has emerged from, I mean, that's also extremely rare, and most particularly in this country, that it did, as you say, act as some sort of a very successful workshop as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Chris, I'm relying on you.
Yes, the ingredients.
Please, the vital ingredients.
I have
Don't
the
talk
ingredients.
about anybody's genitals or...
No genitals.
No.
Okay, I think the ingredients are... we have to know why you're doing a collaboration. And I would say that you do a collaboration because you're looking for artists that can inspire each other to be better artists, and maybe to think in ways they haven't before. So I guess the agenda of a collaboration is to lead you into new territory. So with that in mind, you're looking for complementary artists, not necessarily skills, but the way they think.
How do you determine that, though? I mean, perhaps you can talk
it's intuitive.
specifically.
With When the Rain Stops Falling, it came out of reading, came out of a lot of things, but it came out of reading The Future Eaters by Tim Flannery back in 2004. It was 3 years after September 11th. It just seemed like, it's a bit like now after the bushfires. It was just a very depressed time, and people were aware of global warming and the wars in Iraq, etc., etc. And I was sort of looking for an idea for a show, and had this notion of somehow The Future Eaters being a catalyst for a show. I didn't really know how. And I'd just seen a retrospective of Hussein Valamanes's work, which has a lot of natural Australian materials in it, and they're beautiful installations, they're very theatrical. That somehow seemed to make sense of those ideas. And once that notion came, I suddenly realised that maybe this is a project that Andrew might be interested in, because we'd talked about other projects and nothing had gelled. And if you look at Andrew and Hussein on paper, you may not necessarily sort of say these two artists would fit together, because Hussein works very much in abstractions, and Andrew really is a storyteller, and there's a strong narrative forward drive.
So you just actually contradicted yourself, because you said when you set out, when you were defining this notion of collaboration, you said you look for complementary.
Absolutely.
But
and then I was about to say, but you're not looking necessarily, I was going to go on to say, you're not looking for things that necessarily fit together, but are going to rub up against each other. There's a texture you're looking for, rather than because you want the unexpected to come out of it. And there were things the same. They both sort of stripped things back to their bare essentials. There's a leanness and an economy and a distillation in both their works. But there was this other thing that didn't quite fit together. So you're looking for that, and I think you're looking for a lack of ego. I think that's a really big part of it. You've got to be willing to step into a creative situation and say, I don't know. And not be afraid of the terror that comes when people look at you, because normally you have to arm yourself, certainly in theatre. I'm sure it's much more so in film. It's a tough business with lots of money, so people arm themselves to come with the answers because they don't want to be caught out for being fakes. And then apart from that, the other ingredients are you need to have the energy and effort for the rigour of the work, and you need to be willing to put yourself into the work. And there are people and you want to be part of that kind of process, and it's quite valid not to be, so don't do that kind of process. And my experience has been sometimes people come in and then they get jack of all the kind of the dead ends and things, and they start to sabotage the very thing they said they wanted to do.